The desert was silent that night, the kind of silence so deep it almost rang in your ears. Under a vast ocean of stars, a lone aircraft sliced through the darkness. Its name was stenciled in bold letters across the nose, Lady B. Good. It was April 4th, 1943, and the 9 men inside were on their very first combat mission. The Second World War had pulled them far from home, into a world of danger, duty, and the unknown. Their orders were simple: take off from their base in Solok, Libya, cross the Mediterranean, and bomb the Italian port city of Naples. But war has a way of turning simple plans into deadly mazes. The crew of the Lady B. Good had trained for months, mastering every lever, every instrument of the massive B-24 Liberator bomber. She was a beast of a machine. 4 roaring engines, wings that spanned more than 100 feet, bristling with guns and loaded with destruction. This was her maiden mission, her first real taste of combat. For the men inside, adrenaline was high, their minds sharp, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. As the aircraft approached Naples, the city was shrouded in darkness, cloaked for the night to confuse attackers. Anti-aircraft fire lanced up from the ground, tracer rounds arcing through the black sky. But Lady B. Good pushed on, dropping her deadly cargo over the target before banking away into the night. In those brief moments, they had done their job. They had survived the bombing run. Now all they had to do was make it home. That's when the trouble began. Unknown to them, high-altitude winds, cold and merciless, were shoving the aircraft off course. Their navigational instruments, already strained in the chaos of war, began to betray them. Radio communications crackled with static. The desert and the sea below blurred into a single endless void. Somewhere out there was their base, but it was invisible, a ghost in the night. As the hours passed, the crew believed they were still over the sea, still making their way toward the Libyan coast. What they didn't realize was that they had already flown past their airfield, already crossed the safety of home, without ever seeing it. Now, the Lady B. Good was heading deeper and deeper into the heart of the Sahara Desert, a place so barren and unforgiving it swallowed men whole. The fuel gauges began their slow, merciless descent toward empty. Inside the cockpit, tense voices cut through the hum of the engines. They had no landmarks, no guiding lights, no hope of a visual fix on their location. Just darkness, cold, and the constant nagging sense that something was very, very wrong. Finally, the inevitable came. The fuel was gone. At 2 in the morning, over an endless expanse of sand they could not see, the crew made a decision: bail out. One by one they leapt from the belly of the aircraft, trusting silk parachutes to deliver them to the ground below. Behind them, the Lady B. Good flew on, pilotless, silent but steady, until she touched down in the desert with uncanny grace and vanished into history. The moment their boots hit the sand, the crew of the Lady B. Good was plunged into an alien world. The Sahara at night was not the blazing inferno most imagine. It was a place of bone-chilling cold, where the wind cut like knives, and the stars felt almost close enough to touch. Above them, the last echoes of their bombers' engines faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence so absolute it pressed against their ears. 9 men stood in the darkness, each clutching what little they had carried from the jump: flashlights, pistols, a few canteens of water. None of it would be enough. They had no idea they were hundreds of kilometers from the nearest settlement. In their minds, they were somewhere near the Libyan coast. The plan was simple: walk north until they found the base. But the reality was crueler. The desert stretches endlessly in every direction, and at night, the horizon is a shadowless void. Every step forward felt like progress, but in truth, they were marching deeper into nothing. When morning broke, the desert revealed its true face. A blinding, endless expanse of golden sand shimmered under the pitiless sun. The temperature soared with brutal speed, turning the air into a furnace. The men squinted against the glare, their uniforms offering little protection from the heat. Every breath was hot and dry, every sip from their canteens a dwindling treasure. Still, they pressed on. They were airmen, trained to endure, to survive against odds. Conversations were short, voices low, as each man conserved his strength. One crewman tore a strip from his parachute and wrapped it around his head as a makeshift turban. Another used a compass to keep their direction steady. But the truth was, they were navigating blind. By midday, their lips were cracked, their skin burned, and every grain of sand seemed to pierce their throats like glass. They began rationing water, tiny sips that did little more than wet the tongue. Hunger gnawed at them, but thirst was the real predator. The desert sun was relentless, hammering them without mercy. As night fell again, the cold returned, wrapping them in its icy grip. Their bodies ached, their muscles stiff from the endless march. Yet in the darkness, they found a flicker of hope. Maybe tomorrow, they told each other, they would see the coast. Maybe tomorrow they would find the base. But the desert was not done with them. It had already decided their fate. It would just take time to claim them. By the third day, the desert had stripped away all illusions. Their boots were heavy with sand, their legs moving in stiff, mechanical steps. The horizon never changed, always the same wavering line between blinding gold and merciless blue. The crew of the Lady Be Good had long since stopped talking about finding the base. Now they spoke only of water. Their canteens were nearly empty, each sip weighed against the possibility of another blistering day. One man suggested they fire their pistols into the air, hoping someone might hear. But deep down, they all knew. There was no one out here. The Sahara is not a place where strangers simply appear. Out here, you are alone. Completely. On the fourth day, one of the men collapsed. His face was ashen, lips cracked to the point of bleeding. The others tried to lift him, to carry him forward, but he waved them off, his voice a dry rasp. Go on. Find help. It was a moment no one wanted to face, leaving a comrade behind. But in the desert, sentiment is a luxury. If they stopped, they would all die together. The group pressed on, each step taking them further into the wasteland. The sand reflected the sun's glare like shards of glass, burning their eyes until they saw phantom images, mirages of water, of palm trees swaying in a cool breeze. More than once, a man stumbled toward one of these illusions, only to collapse when the shimmering oasis dissolved into empty air. By the fifth night, their bodies were in rebellion. Their tongues were swollen, their minds clouded with delirium. Some spoke to people who weren't there. Others laughed softly at private jokes no one else understood. Survival was now measured in hours, not days. One by one, the crew began to drop away, some sitting down in the sand and simply never standing up again, others wandering off into the dark, following hallucinations only they could see. The survivors looked back and saw nothing but footprints disappearing into the wind. When the sun rose again, there were fewer of them, but those still alive kept walking, driven by the stubborn, impossible belief that salvation lay just beyond the next dune. They did not know that the nearest well was still over 100 kilometers away. In the Sahara, distance is a lie. Every step feels like progress, but in truth, the desert is standing still, and it is you who are fading away. By the sixth day, the survivors of the Lady Be Good were shadows of the men who had once climbed aboard that bomber in Libya. Their uniforms hung loose from bodies burned and wasted by the sun. Lips were split wide, tongues like leather, eyes sunken deep into skulls that now seemed too heavy to lift. Yet somehow they moved forward, sometimes crawling, sometimes staggering, always toward a horizon that never came closer. They had begun to ration water in drops, not sips, tiny beads that barely touched the tongue before vanishing. A few had no water left at all, their canteens light and mocking in their hands. The sand, once merely hot, now seemed alive, whispering in the wind, promising rest if they would just lie down. And some listened to that whisper. One man sank to his knees, then sat. "I'll just rest a while," he murmured. By the time the others looked back, he was still, his face peaceful at last. Those who pressed on walked in silence. Their boots were worn through at the soles, feet blistered and bleeding. Every muscle screamed for them to stop, but their minds clung to a single thread. Maybe there was a village ahead. Maybe there was a chance. Yet the only signs of life were the shifting dunes and the occasional lonely stone. The desert plays tricks on dying men. Shapes on the horizon became ships, lakes, towns, visions so real they drew the last strength from weary legs. One man shouted that he could see the base, pointing toward the mirage with trembling hands. He ran ahead, stumbling over the sand until he fell and did not rise. As the sun fell behind the dunes, the temperature plummeted. The cold stabbed as sharply as the heat had burned, turning sweat into ice against their skin. The survivors huddled together for warmth, each breath fogging in the frigid air. In the darkness, someone began to pray. Another whispered his mother's name. Sleep came in shallow bursts, and every time one awoke, there was the fear that the man beside him might not. By the seventh day, there were only a few left. They no longer spoke of rescue, only of putting one foot in front of the other. They did not know it, but the sands were already covering their tracks, erasing their story grain by grain. In a matter of days, the desert would hide them completely. Somewhere far behind them, under the same sun, the Lady Be Good lay silent and unbroken, waiting for a search party that would not come for another 16 years. 16 years. That's how long the Lady Be Good remained lost, entombed in the sands of the Sahara. No one knew she was there. No one even guessed. After that night in 1943, she simply vanished. The military assumed she had gone down at sea, swallowed by the dark waters of the Mediterranean. Official reports filed her under missing in action, and life moved on. The war ended, new conflicts began, and the desert kept its secret. But in 1959, fate intervened. A team of oil prospectors was conducting an aerial survey over the Libyan desert, searching for signs of potential drilling sites. From the cockpit of a small reconnaissance plane, one of the men spotted something unusual below. A long, pale shape, too symmetrical to be a natural formation. They circled back for another look, and the shape resolved into the unmistakable outline of an aircraft. It was resting at a strange angle, half buried in sand, but still intact. Its olive drab paint faded by the sun. Its nose art reading, in bold white letters, "Lady Be Good." There were no signs of an explosion, no gaping wounds in the fuselage. The desert, in its strange way, had preserved her almost perfectly. When the discovery was reported, the U.S. Air Force sent a recovery team to investigate. What they found was nothing short of astonishing. Inside the bomber, the controls were frozen in place, radios silent, and equipment scattered just as it had been left. There were thermos flasks, still holding a few drops of liquid. Logbooks remained on board, recording the mission's final moments in precise handwriting. Even rations were there, untouched, as if the crew had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. But there was no sign of the men. The desert around the wreck was empty, its dunes undisturbed except for faint, almost invisible traces that led away from the plane. These tracks, half swallowed by the sands, hinted at the journey the crew had taken after bailing out. In the weeks that followed, search parties began scouring the surrounding wasteland. The heat was brutal, the distances vast. Yet, little by little, the desert began to give up its dead. The first body was found far from the crash site, lying in the sand as if asleep. He had been walking north, always north, toward a salvation that had never come. More would follow, each discovery piecing together the puzzle of what had happened in those final days. The truth was worse than anyone imagined. The crew had landed much farther from safety than they believed. Their march through the Sahara had been a death sentence from the very first step. The recovery teams pressed deeper into the desert, following the faint clues left behind by men who had vanished almost 2 decades earlier. The first body had been found more than 130 kilometers from the Lady Be Good. As they moved farther out, searchers came across scattered objects, mute witnesses to the struggle for survival. A parachute tangled in a dry bush, its fabric bleached by the sun. A canteen lying half buried in the sand. A single boot, its leather cracked and curling. Each find told the same story. They had kept moving until they could move no more. Soon, more remains were uncovered. Some were found together, suggesting that the men had tried to stay in pairs during their final days. Others were alone, their bodies positioned as though they had simply sat down to rest and never awakened. The desert's preservation was eerie. Clothing was still recognizable, and personal effects were remarkably intact. Watches had stopped at unknown hours. Sunglasses still clung to skeletal faces. There were logbooks, letters from home, even harmonicas and playing cards. These small human items were haunting reminders that these were not just soldiers. They were sons, brothers, husbands. The search teams realized that the crew had bailed out while the Lady Be Good still had enough altitude to carry itself further. The aircraft had glided on for many miles after the men had parachuted into the darkness. By the time they touched down, the bomber was far ahead of them, but they didn't know it. Believing they were near the coast, the crew began walking in the wrong direction, away from civilization and deeper into the desert's lethal heart. Investigators calculated that the men had walked for 8 days, covering incredible distances despite their desperate condition. Some had made it as far as 140 kilometers before collapsing. For men weakened by thirst, hunger, and the searing heat, it was an extraordinary display of endurance. But in the Sahara, endurance means little without water. Not all the remains were recovered. A few were never found at all, their final resting places lost forever under shifting dunes. The desert, as if reluctant to give up all its secrets, kept part of the Lady Be Good story buried. Yet, from what was recovered, the Air Force pieced together a haunting reconstruction of the mission. A crew lost in the night sky, navigating by instruments that betrayed them, overshooting their base without ever seeing it, then fighting a hopeless battle against one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. The tale of the Lady Be Good spread quickly once the recovery teams returned with their findings. Newspapers called it a ghost plane, a relic that had slipped through the cracks of time. Photographs of the wreck stunned the public. There she was, resting almost gracefully on the sand, her fuselage largely intact, propellers still in place, even the machine guns mounted as if ready for battle. It was as if she had been frozen in the final moments of 1943 and simply waited to be found. Experts examined the aircraft in detail, amazed at the condition of a machine that had endured 16 years in the Sahara. The lack of moisture had preserved not only the airframe, but also the smallest of details. Labels on control panels, ammunition still in belts, logbooks that could be read as clearly as the day they were written. Engineers speculated that, had she been refueled and serviced, she might have flown again. The crew's final march gripped the imagination of military historians and civilians alike. Their story was not just one of navigational error, it was about the will to live against impossible odds. Walking over 130 kilometers without adequate water, through days of blistering heat and freezing nights, they had fought every step until their bodies simply failed. Each discovery in the desert was a piece of that courage frozen in time. In military briefings, the Lady Be Good became a case study in survival and navigation. The lessons learned from her tragedy influenced training for future pilots, emphasizing desert survival, emergency navigation, and the dangers of over-reliance on instruments without visual confirmation. Yet for many, the story went beyond lessons. It was a haunting reminder of how thin the line between life and death can be in war. Eventually, parts of the aircraft were removed for study and preservation. Some found their way to museums. Others were tested for the effects of long-term exposure to the desert environment. But large sections of the Lady Be Good remained where she had landed, a lonely sentinel in an endless sea of sand. Over the years, scavengers, weather, and time slowly wore her down, but even decades later, fragments could still be found, scattered across the dunes. What lingered most was not the wreck itself, but the image of 9 men stepping into the dark that night, unaware they were leaving behind one of aviation's most enduring mysteries. They had vanished into the Sahara, but their story had refused to stay buried. Today, the story of the Lady Be Good stands as one of the most enduring legends in aviation history. A tale whispered in flight schools, told in documentaries, and remembered by historians as both a tragedy and a testament to human endurance. The desert has long since begun reclaiming her, winds slowly dismantling the bomber piece by piece, scattering fragments across the sand. Yet the ghost of that night in 1943 still lingers, as vivid as if it happened yesterday. In the decades after her discovery, visitors who made the arduous journey to the crash site spoke of the eerie stillness that surrounds her remains. No sound but the wind, no movement but the shifting dunes. Standing beside what's left of the fuselage, you can almost picture the crew inside, laughing nervously before takeoff, adjusting their gear, readying themselves for the mission. You can imagine the sudden confusion after the bombing run, the tension in the cockpit as instruments betrayed them, and finally, the silent glide into the desert darkness. Artifacts recovered from the site found their way into museums and private collections. A thermos, a wristwatch, even a simple pair of gloves. All ordinary objects that became extraordinary because of where they were found. Each item holds a fragment of the story, a tangible link to men who faced the ultimate test and walked into history without knowing it. For the families, the recovery brought closure, though it was a bittersweet one. Letters were returned, personal effects catalogued, remains laid to rest with honor. Yet the mystery of those long, final days, what they said to each other, what they dreamed about in restless sleep under the desert stars, remains locked away, known only to the Sahara itself. The Lady Be Good's fate is a stark reminder of how quickly the world can swallow even the largest of machines, and how a single navigational error can become a fight for survival. But it is also a reminder of something greater, that courage can persist even in the face of certain death. Now, more than 80 years later, her name still carries weight. The words, "Lady Be Good," are etched not just on the metal of a lost bomber, but into the memory of anyone who hears her story. She may have vanished into the sands, but the legend will never disappear.